All right, thank you for attending BIM Growth Individual to Organization. This presentation will define responsibilities, will identify different BIM titles and roles, and share different approaches to becoming, training, recruiting, consulting, managing, and leading BIM adopters. Your presenters today are myself, Allison Harper, and my coworker, Jordan Billingsley. We work for Hord Coplan Macht, which is an architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, and planning firm in the United States. I'm based in the Denver, Colorado office, and Jordan is in our Baltimore, Maryland office. And between the two of us, we have many years of experience in the architecture field. I am a licensed architect, and Jordan has been featured in a book as well as presented at many conferences. So I'm going to kick things off by identifying and defining these different terminology, positions, responsibilities, really just trying to make sense of these different items floating around on your screen. So these are just some of the responsibilities that we've noticed for BIM. You've got training, model and family maintenance, a BIM execution plan, standards and enforcement, providing technical support, BIM implementation, software versioning, and advancing and competing. And often we find that these responsibilities are pushed onto a project manager. And this is really unfortunate because obviously they have their own project responsibilities. So somebody's got to look out for the little guy, right? Well, we think somebody's got to look out for the middle guy. We don't want to overload our project managers. So we propose that you take those BIM responsibilities and you put them onto a BIM specific person, whatever that title might be. And on top of that, it is important to have soft skills. There's many wonderful presentations on soft skills specific to BIM positions, so I'm not going to go into that today, but we think having the soft skills on top of these BIM responsibilities is very important. Before I go any further, I do want to clarify, we understand that BIM is not Revit, Revit is not BIM. But if you're an expert in Excel, you wouldn't call yourself an Excel specialist, you would call yourself a data specialist. So along those same lines, if you're an expert in Revit, you wouldn't call yourself a Revit specialist, you would call yourself a BIM specialist. So we use BIM and Revit kind of interchangeably here, understanding that there is a difference. So now we need to go into defining what a title and a role are. So a title is a name that describes someone's position or job. So that would be a full or part-time staff member that their job is to take on those BIM responsibilities. Whereas a role is a function assumed or a part played by a person in a particular situation. So going back to that project manager example, maybe they are the Revit expert in the office, and so they might take on a role of BIM support, but that's not their job. So we propose having a model manager role, so someone that would be responsible for the project's success, and or having a support group. So if you only have a part-time BIM staff member, you could have a support group of people that could kind of fill in the gap there. These are some of the titles and roles that we've seen out there. There's a lot of BIM, we've got CAD, we've got IPD, we've got VDC. Because Jordan and I are from the architecture background, we're just going to focus on the BIM side of it. And then we have seen some of these groups out there as well. A couple years ago, Michael Kilkelly of ArcSmarter asked in his community about this rule of thumb that he'd always heard, and I'd heard this as well, that you need about 1 to 40 BIM support to Revit user. So he was curious, is that the ratio that others are seeing in their firms? And the answer is, it depends. What does that depend on? There's a couple things. So the technological maturity, not only of the firm, but of the person moving into that BIM support. Obviously, a big one is the firm willingness to spend money. Hopefully, you at least get a part-time BIM support, but a completely overhead position would be ideal. The level of detail or size of the projects is another big deciding factor. So if you're a firm that has projects that you kind of repeat time and time again, not much difference between, you wouldn't need the same sort of support as one that's quite large or has a lot of details, has a lot of moving parts, a lot of coordination, that would need a lot more support. And then finally, the full-time staff to group ratio. So again, this kind of ties into the firm willingness to spend money. If you can't have a full-time staff member, then having that group is helpful. So what do we do with this? It helps to have clear, concise titles and responsibilities, as well as establish an organizational structure. Jordan and I were curious and we came up with our own survey, and we wanted to know what were some of the BIM-related groups, departments, teams, committees. What are some of those BIM-related titles? We asked people to briefly describe the BIM organizational structure, as well as briefly describe the responsibilities of the roles. So these are some of the BIM-related groups that we heard from. You can see some are pretty specific. You've got BIM standards, you've got a technical department, training groups. But the important takeaway here is that these groups are starting to exist at firms. My favorite you can see at the bottom in the middle column is there is a group that exists. It doesn't even have a name yet, but it is there. So that is great to hear. And then for the BIM related titles, there's a wide variety here as well. And this is kind of what kicked off this presentation to begin with, is when you're looking for a job, a PM, a PA, those roles are kind of understood across different firms, but a BIM specific position, there's a lot of overlap with responsibilities and trying to understand what the difference is between these different names. And so we kind of focused on BIM coordinator, BIM director, BIM manager, and BIM specialist. And as a rough draft, just trying to make sense of things, we thought a BIM specialist might be the first step in a firm, and they could take care of the BIM execution plan training, providing that technical support, as well as the standards and enforcement. Then as the project grows or the firm grows, maybe then a BIM manager can step in, and they would also take care of those responsibilities, but also help with the model maintenance, maybe getting ahead of the fires rather than just putting them out. And then again, as it grows, maybe then you have a BIM coordinator. They could help with the IT department with the BIM implementation and software versioning. And then to round out a department, a BIM director might be the top there. And they would be focused on the strategy as well as advancing and competing the BIM initiatives of this firm. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my coworker, Jordan, to talk about transformational growth.
Thank you, Allison, for helping us make sense of some of the most common BIM title roles and responsibilities. I believe a solid understanding of the BIM requirements beyond licensing, beyond hardware, and beyond infrastructure is critical to the adoption. But before we dive into the relationship between those, let's first recognize all of you that have struggled to communicate with decision makers. So I've been in this position myself. It feels like a Sisyphean task, coming up against the same challenges time and time again, roadblocks, and you just feel doomed. But I want to let you know that you are not condemned. Your strategy, your approach is key to reaching the tipping point. And I know I'm mixing metaphors here, but when you reach the summit, cultural change has a snowball effect on becoming true adopters. All right, so let's jump in with a short little exercise that I developed for determining where your company lies in terms of investment and understanding. I encourage you to do this yourself or with leadership or together. It is totally fine. But first, draw 2 lines creating 4 equal quadrants. And across the top, write invested and not invested. Then down the side, write understood and not understood. And then ask your leaders and yourself where the company is in terms of BIM technology. And then depending on your sample size, a scatter plot will start to emerge, and you can help use this to guide the discussion and hopefully uncover some of the communication pitfalls that you may have had in the past. All right, now here comes the magic part. You don't want to reveal the titles of the quadrants until you've collected all of the responses. Once you do, you can reveal them and go over the differences between adopters, consumers, groups that are risk adverse, and plain ignorant. And I don't mean that in a negative way. You don't know what you don't know, right? So the reason why I approach this exercise this way is that if you simply ask people to identify, there's going to be an aspirational bias. People are going to naturally want to gravitate towards saying, yes, we are BIM adopters. After all, we all want to be, and we all market ourselves as such. But in reality, if we're being honest, we probably get closer to the consumer label. And I hope this isn't disappointing, because what I really want to talk to you today about as an individual, you can bring this change to your firm through shifting culture. So let's take a closer look at that word culture. And I always like to start with a quote. I love this quote. that's often attributed to Peter Drucker because he said culture eats strategy for breakfast. And you've probably heard that quote or something similar before. But for me, the essence is that culture is best done by doing, not by planning. So some of those aspects of culture may be stated and are obvious, like a company's mission, their goals, or their best practices, but even the stated aspects may not be the shared reality. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about culture, the shared reality. And the dominating aspects of that shared reality are unspoken behaviors, instinctive habits, and emotional responses. If you're ever having trouble identifying what your company's true culture is, all you have to do is look for this hell yes response. If you're getting quiet nodding to your proposals, just please do not assume agreement. You really want to get to this emotional, emphatic response. All right. So, one last exercise that you should do with yourself, the decision makers, or your clients. Um, as with anything complex, the measure of your understanding is being able to state your culture simply. So, can you state your culture in 5 words or less? It's a great exercise that we should all take on because a concise, memorable, and intimate understanding of your culture builds the language that you're going to need to communicate with all the cultural influencers. All right. So, cultural influencers, what is that? Who are we talking about? The short answer is that everyone is a cultural influencer. After all, culture is not in a vacuum. We all impact our environment, but I'm going to break it down into these 3 buckets: the top, the bottom, and the outside. And you need to be able to speak each of these languages if you want to start a movement and create culture. So for the top, we're mostly talking about the business leaders and the investment decision makers. For the bottom, we're describing the top performers or producers. And for the outside influencers, we're describing forces outside of your organization. So let's take a closer look at the top. This group is primarily charged with determining value, making decisions, and protecting investments. Here are 3 examples to help you better understand the language of top leaders. One of the most universal responsibilities that I've seen of top leaders is management of the software investment. And the first objective is to accurately measure that. And I wrote a 5-step article on how to do this in more detail, but here are the bullet points. First, you need to take an inventory of what's currently installed. Then create a short survey for your end users. And that survey is not going to be a complete answer, so you'll have to conduct interviews to ask the hard questions in person. You can look to what your competitors are doing and see if there's any convergence, but ultimately you're going to have to analyze and make the decision. But this will be the formation of your roadmap. So that was kind of slow thinking, and on the other end is fast thinking, where we generally rely on heuristics. So we're going to share 2 of them with you now. Allison actually mentioned one earlier, and I would say that you should always plan or strive for that 1:40 ratio. Your mileage will certainly vary depending on who you hire and their expertise, but you can choose to hire a consultant, you can recruit, you can develop internally, or a combination of these to achieve that ratio. The second concerns staffing, and it is more psychological, because if you plan to have a resource internally, strive for a 50% utilization ratio or full time. I say this is psychological because if you put somebody at an 80% billable ratio and then 20% BIM support, for example, or some type of overhead, you know that they're going to still be 100% on project work. That's just the demands of the people that have staffing to meet deadlines. And so then what ends up happening is they do an extra 10% because they're passionate on trying to support your BIM implementation. And that risks 1, burnout of the individual, and 2, your BIM success. So the last concept is along those same lines, and the best term for this is technical debt, which is a very established term in software engineering. Carnegie Mellon defines this as the trade-off between the short-term benefit of rapid delivery and long-term value. If we take this into our BIM context, it means that stretching our resources thin without specialists and accumulating this technology debt by learning as you go, doing something project by project, or just not following or not knowing best practices, it's going to jeopardize your investment further and will likely be more costly in the long run. So I have one more bonus tip for the top leaders and their language, and I like to call it a passion pitfalls. So we need to be really careful if you're in this top leader group um, to not label your high performers as gurus or power users or that BIM guy slash gal. Because depending on your tone and the context, these labels can be seen as positive recognition or negative dismissal. So instead, look for your company's path forward using informal roles with protected time that can grow into formal positions. All right. So we're going to move into the next group, but there's a little segue here that I'd like to submit, and it has to do with a term that I coined in the book Super Users. When I originally came up with this term, I was a bottom leader, and I was attempting to describe the uncertainty of specialization. But now that I'm kind of quasi in the top group, I also see it as a roadmap for building our own team. So the essence of this is that navigating from traditional titles to emerging roles isn't very straightforward. As decision makers, it's important to not immediately take an existing position and foist new responsibilities onto an exhausted resource. This comes from the idea of supporting passion rather than relying on it. For example, a CAD manager may not be a good fit for your BIM manager. And this comes back to what Allison was saying about the understanding of BIM responsibilities, because the skills required will help with the operational strategy. All right. So let's keep going, and we're going to formally go into the bottom leader group. And the first thing that I want to point out is that in the previous section, it's pretty easy to call the top the leaders. But I want you to know that there's leaders throughout the company, throughout the different hierarchy. In fact, when it comes to influencing culture, I would agree that the grassroots initiatives are more successful since they're seen as more genuine and unfettered. So for you bottom-up leaders, it's important to recognize that the culture is not born in a vacuum. I have some advice on how you can be effective in shaping, shifting, and moving the elements that define culture. So let's take a look at these. The first is recognizing your power. I wasn't able to accurately find the origin of this phrase to give it proper credit, but it's not mine. And it basically is leading from where you are. And concept is about embracing who you are, your strengths, your aspirations, and actively developing the relationships that compensate for your weaknesses or can mentor your growth so that you can be more impactful. So as you take on or even propose initiatives, we want to make sure that we're genuine. Don't go after what you think others want. Nurture what really matters to you and be visible by hanging that freak flag high. So while niches are good, we need to make sure that we don't get comfortable. Be sure that you're continuously improving. Negotiate for a professional development expense account that can be used for traditional classes, conferences, seminars, online courses, and supporting just communities or open source initiatives. And then this is going to be the toughest one for you bottom leaders. You're going to have to learn how to let go. So what I mean by letting go is that you're going to be gaining experience through your continuous improvement, and you're going to be growing, and eventually you're going to need to empower somebody else to hand over your successful initiatives for somebody else to take on as their own leadership or to act as the caretaker. Okay, so just like with the last group, passion pitfalls, it's kind of a two-way street here, and I wanted to identify some red flags for you top performers. You are responsible for clearly communicating and co-developing a growth plan with those top leaders. While I believe there's great opportunities for those who stay within a firm and help build it up from the bottom up, there are some red flags that you need to be looking out for as well. So there's a list there that you can read and take away what you will, but the biggest is fear-based decision making. If you see top leaders making too many decisions based on what other people are doing, or they lack trust in the expert advice or from your consultants or from you as you gain experience, that could be an unwillingness for adoption. All right, now let's move to the outside group. And we don't have a lot of control over this group, obviously, but I think it's still important to stay vigilant. So here are some things to keep an eye out for. One is be aware of the increasing client needs and requirements. We're seeing clients now come with their BIM execution plans and their own standards. So we want to make sure that we're aware of the increasing needs and nimble enough to adopt them. We also always need to be aware how others are advancing. And with new program offerings from institutions, we can look at that as an industry acceptance or convergence. And then probably what I would say is the most important is that we stay vigilant on the encroaching fields with similar tools. So the biggest example I like to give here is the entertainment industry with their growing recruitment of architects for game development and the fast pace of their production and ideation. Certainly something to keep an eye out for. So let's now try to apply what we've covered today and apply it to some overly simplified scenarios. So bear with me here. But here's scenario one. We have a small firm that wants to collaborate in a BIM environment, but has not yet made the initial software investment. We put a sample profile here. We said there's about 10 people in it, and they're in one market sector. It seems like an easy lift, and it can be tempting to just say, all right, we're going to buy some BIM licenses and get off on the next project. But I would actually advocate for taking a more thoughtful decision route. First, I would recommend that the firm appoint a BIM specialist and also hire a consultant. This could be done through a reseller, somebody that you find through a conference, or other advocate. But together, the BIM specialist and the consultant will develop the standards and support the BIM conversion process. But the BIM specialist can't be the only one for project execution work. So an informal model manager role should also be assigned to each project. And that's primarily responsible for the model's performance or health. And then lastly, during this BIM onboarding period, all technical users should meet daily for a time-boxed 20-minute meeting focused on identifying issues, reviewing mistakes, and also answering questions. So depending on how many projects that firm has and how quickly you can do the BIM conversion will factor into how long you can move into phase two. So with phase two, which would be more of like how you operate, more operational, we would still see a BIM specialist, but it's also at this time that you should evaluate the fit. So did the appointment of your original specialist suit that person? Were they stimulated or were they overwhelmed? If they're not a good fit, you might want to consider increasing the consultant engagement while you find a more suitable candidate. That'll just keep everybody a little bit more happy if it wasn't a good fit. We do still encourage that the model manager assignments remain and that a monthly 1-hour training be instituted. All right, let's go on to scenario two. A firm with both architecture and interior architecture that would like to better coordinate their scopes of work in an established BIM environment. A formal role should probably be established from within the group of experts that are already there. Ideally, this should be a full-time person if it wasn't already, but it could be divided into 2 dedicated 50% positions. In this scenario, a BIM coordinator title would be most appropriate, and they would control the decision-making when a divergence of workflows between those 2 market sectors appears. So over time, or once the agreements are met, you can move into an operational framework where the BIM coordinator would be the most impactful, focused on content development and curation so that the assets are optimally shared. All right, scenario 3, and this is our last scenario. This is a large firm. It's multidisciplinary. Architecture and engineering is looking to bring their engineer group into an established BIM environment. They have some established experts as well. They have specialization, but they're lacking some hierarchy. In this case, a BIM manager or possibly a director should be recruited or appointed alongside a trusted consultant to co-develop a BIM strategy. Initially, the BIM manager or director would be purely focused on team building between the existing specialists. But eventually, they will be known as the keepers of knowledge, content, and charged with the BIM advancement. All right, so we hope this presentation has been helpful to you as an individual, as a decision maker, certainly as a leader, and that includes our consultant friends, and better understand / envision your path forward for transformational growth. I don't expect anyone to take more than 3 concepts with them, but if I had to choose, here are some that I think foster adopter mindsets. Now we'd like to end this presentation and make ourselves available for the Q&A. Thank you.